One of the things that I wanted to do is basically go back and offer a little bit of history as far as the Constitution, and this will just be very, very quick like. The basic question from the outline, and I'll post this in my MC, is going to be, what is the Constitution? Well, the Constitution, when you think about it, it was actually written. It was written by James Madison. We talked about this earlier. Thomas Jefferson is considered the father, if you will, of the Declaration of Independence. James Madison is actually considered the father or the primary drafter of the United States Constitution. Now granted, they did this in Constitutional Convention, obviously, so there were more than just Madison that did this. But bottom line, if Jefferson is the father of the Declaration, Madison is considered the father of the Constitution. What you'll see is that the American Constitution is the oldest written constitution in the world. Now obviously Britain was around a lot longer than the United States, but even to this day, Great Britain does not have a written constitution. If you look at a country like Brazil, for example, Brazil is a country that has a written constitution that is unbelievably thorough and detailed. They're going to regulate things like maximum wage, or minimum wage, maximum hour type laws. They're going to regulate specific policies. The American Constitution, though, is really significant because it is only 4,543 words if you do not include the amendments. So rather than being specific, the Constitution is important because it's not just what it says, but what it doesn't say. And as I've said in class, it's not just what it says or doesn't say, but it's also who's reading it that determines its meaning. 4,543 words. They wrote this very, very vague to give them freedom to be able to move within the words of the Constitution, to formulate policies, to develop the new government. Now when you look, there are 27 amendments that have actually passed. So basically, on average, you get an amendment about every 8 years over the course of American history. Now having said this, there are over 10,000 amendments that have been proposed. Understand, just because they were proposed, it does not mean that these were even voted on. It does not mean that they were voted down. It just means that they were proposed and placed into the hopper. Only 27 have passed, and in the grand scheme of things, not really all that many more than 27 really went to the mat, so to speak, like the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment that we talked about earlier. If you go to page 32 from the chapter, what you'll see is that it lists 3 Congresses worth of possible amendments. And these were Congresses, the last 3 Congresses prior to the publication of the text, mentioning things like non-natural born citizens being able to run for president, term limits, for example, for Congress, the idea of schools being allowed to require prayer at public meetings and maybe even graduation ceremonies, and certainly prohibiting the desecration of the American flag, because believe it or not, it's 100% legal to burn the flag in the United States today. What I'm going to do is I'm also going to add a quote, a clip, if you will, from the movie With Honors. And this was a Brendan Fraser movie. And Brendan Fraser, this was really before he was Brendan Fraser, the big star, one of his first movies. And when you look at this, Brendan Fraser is actually a government student who is going to Harvard. In this, he gets into a discussion in his political science class with a homeless man and his political science instructor. And the homeless man actually explains what the Constitution means. Joe Pesci is the actor, and basically what he says is that the Constitution is a living, breathing document. Because it's only 4,543 words, the idea is that you're going to be able to read it in a very broad sense so that it's going to be applicable to a lot of different circumstances. It's going to be applicable. So when you think about searches and seizures, maybe back in the day they didn't want people kicking in doors, but then when you think about it, opening mail or opening email or wiretapping telephone conversations, for example, all technological things that deal with searches and seizures would still be covered because the Fourth Amendment was written so broadly. As far as balancing is concerned, what you'll see is that the Constitution is going to balance a number of different controversies in American life today. So for example, the first one is going to be the national government versus the state government. What you'll see is that there are probably over 88,000 governments in the United States today. Over 88,000 governments. Of course, there's one federal government, there's 50 state governments, and then you start getting into county governments, city governments, school boards, and it goes on down the line. Over 88,000. One of the things that the federal Constitution is going to balance specifically is going to be the relationship between the federal government up at the top and then state government, which is going to be a couple of notches lower. Now, when you think about this, national versus state, One of the articles that I'm going to post in my MC is actually dealing with the fine state of Texas. The Texas governor is beginning to call for secession. He's basically saying that Washington is out of touch. Not only is Washington out of touch, it doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't know how to balance a budget. It's basically going to cost, in his words, us Texans far too much to be citizens within the United States as opposed to just seceding and having Texas start its own country. Well, here's the kick on this. When you're dealing with national versus state relations, again, the United States Constitution under the Supremacy Clause is going to be the supreme law of the land, which means that when you think about this, anything that a state does contrary to the Constitution is going to be unconstitutional, it's going to be null, and it's going to be void. If Texas tries to secede, basically the Texas governor's argument is, if we leave the Union, then we're not going to be responsible for these higher taxes. We're not going to be responsible, say, for the budget deficits and things like this. Of course, the federal government's answer is, number one, if Texas, you leave, you will also be sacrificing all of your federal Social Security contributions, which means your citizens are going to get screwed out of their retirement. And Democrats are actually especially happy about Texas maybe leaving for the simple fact that it's a big red state, and if you take away that big red state, it's going to make it easier for Democrats to get elected. Freedom versus order is another one that we've talked about throughout the course of the class. The Constitution is going to balance individual freedom versus the government's responsibility to provide order. And when we talk about freedom versus order, we've used a number of examples of this. Whether you're talking about the Catholic confession case, whether you're talking, for example, about the Catholic school teacher, for example, and that pregnancy, whether you're talking, for example, about young felons maybe getting a conviction erased if they do the appropriate amount of community service. The federal Constitution is going to try and balance this. And maybe the best example that we talked about were those searches and seizures involving the drugs, involving the idea of the blood on the fingernail after a female murdered her boyfriend type thing. These are all examples of balancing freedom versus order. Which side do you come down on? The side of the individual to do as he or she pleases versus the government's responsibility to provide order. The third balancing act that it's going to have is the idea of balancing branch versus branch disputes. We've talked about this. There's three branches in the United States government. You've got a Congress in Article 1, an executive in Article 2, and then of course you've got the judiciary or the courts in Article 3. Sometimes these branches are going to fight against one another, and when they fight against one another, who ultimately decides who's going to win? Good example of this that we talked about in class would be, say, a line item veto, for example. Another good example of this would be that war powers resolution, limiting the president to be able to station troops overseas for 60 days without any congressional approval. But another article that I'm going to post in the chapter is actually dealing with Congress's role in the Supreme Court. One of the questions that I ask classes oftentimes is, how many members are on the United States Supreme Court? Some folks say 6. Some folks say 12. Some folks say 9. Some folks do actually get it right, and the answer is 9. But here's the thing. Article 3 of the United States Constitution does not give a specific number of justices. So throughout American history, this number has risen and fallen. And Congress actually is the body that determines the membership. So one of the ways that the Constitution will attempt to limit or referee, if you will, branch versus branch controversies is by allowing Congress to set the membership of the United States Supreme Court. And the thought is that if the Supreme Court gets a little bit renegade, for example, Congress will lower the membership or maybe raise it. They might raise it so that they can get more justices on there to try and eliminate this renegade spirit. They may lower it in the sense, hey, we've got our majority on here, we'd like to keep it exactly as it is. In Lincoln's time, Andrew Johnson was the first president in American history to be impeached. Andrew Johnson. Not Nixon, not Clinton, but Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, although he survived his impeachment, he was not found guilty, the Congress actually went in and they eliminated justices from the Supreme Court because they basically said, you know what, we don't want Andrew Johnson, this idiot, to be making these appointments. So we're going to limit the president's power as well. Again, what you'll see is that the Constitution is going to balance different conflicts. National government versus state government. It's going to balance conflicts, freedom of the citizen versus order provided by the government. And then thirdly, as I just mentioned, it's going to balance branch versus branch in order to figure out which one comes out top. If you got any questions about this, don't hesitate to give me a holler.